Yes, again, good morning, Jim. I'm Captain Denis Faherty, United States Navy, retired.
And what did you do in the Navy?
Well, they make a well-rounded officer by design. However, my specialty was I was a naval flight officer, and I ended up flying fighter aircraft, both F-4 Phantoms, particularly in Vietnam, and in the F-14 Tomcat after that.
So you're a Navy fighter pilot.
Yes, sir.
Okay, well, we know all about Navy fighter pilots from the movies, don't we?
We do.
Um, well, you and I had the opportunity to see the movie recently, and you saw the first Top Gun movie. So why don't you tell me a little bit about seeing the original Top Gun movie?
It was pretty spectacular as far as the Navy was concerned at Naval Air Station Miramar, where it was filmed. We had a year or so advance warning that this was going to happen, and we never expected that it would turn out the high quality that it did. I had several friends that actually participated in the filming to represent the bogey pilots and the bandits and all of those things that are part of the movie. And I did get a phone call one day in 1985, and as I was working in my office, a couple of my buddies are on the phone, and they say, "Hey, Wildman, can you come over to Top Gun? We're going to go out drinking with these two actors, Tom Cruise and Anthony Edwards, and we're going to start at the Officers Club." Well, we did, and I'll tell you what, Jim, they were the nicest gentlemen you ever want to meet. And they were ecstatic. They had all gotten rides in the F-14 in the back seat, and the only person not to get sick was Tom Cruise.
Well, and I know he's a private pilot now. I don't know if he had his private pilot's license at that time, but obviously he likes to fly.
He's aerodynamically adapted, so let's put it that way.
And that process includes.
Well, there's any number of ways to do it. The Navy has a program for that now, where they put you in some of the, before they invest millions of dollars in your training, they want to find out if you're aeronautically adaptable. And they have some machines down at Pensacola that are unbelievable. They put you in a little capsule, standing up. Part of the capsule goes one direction, the outside of the capsule goes another direction. So it is screwing around significantly with your semicircular canals, which is the issue about getting sick and all that in your ears. And they have washed many of aviator out because it's unadaptability to flying.
So they spin you around, they turn you upside down, they spin you around real fast, and they see whether or not you can adapt. If
Absolutely
you're going to
correct.
have constant air sickness or loss of situational awareness
Correct.
and those kinds of things to see if your body can actually adapt to a flying situation.
Correct. And they have you go through some training for things you can do, to particularly if you're in the environment of unusual attitudes in high G,
Mhm.
that can induce that type of environment. And there's also issues where what you do with your head,
Mhm.
moving your head down into the right or down into the left will induce disorientation, and normally closely followed by an upset tummy.
Okay, so I got to ask, if you went out drinking with Tom Cruise and Anthony Edwards, you got to tell us those stories.
Well, they're again two of the nicest guys you've ever want to meet. And when we left the officers club and left Naval Air Station Miramar, we went to a local community in La Jolla, California, which is a pretty nice area. And it was amazing how many women looked at those two guys but didn't look at us. I was just dumbfounded for that. Because didn't they know we were Navy fighter pilots? My gosh.
But of course, you weren't wearing a flight suit or your Navy whites, right?
That's correct. We were not. And neither were they, but they were highly recognizable at that point in time. And coincidentally, again, this was 1985. The Navy officer who was the participant in the movie to make sure all of the military aspects of it were correct and not generate a lot of phony situations that really military people would pick up in a minute. His name is Pete Pettigrew, and his call sign is Viper. And what they did in the movie, if you remember, the first movie, is they had Tom Skerritt, the actor. He played Viper.
He was the commander of Top
He
Gun.
was the commander of Top Gun, and his call sign was Viper. And coincidentally, they put him in the movie in a second, not even a role. He had some words where he walked into the officers' club with Kelly McGillis and sat down with her. And by the way, the Kelly McGillis character is from a real person that existed, and her name was Christine Fox, and and her call sign was Legs, because she was a very, very tall woman, beautiful and brilliant. She was a PhD, and she worked a lot with our human factors departments and things, and so we kind of fed the beast for characters, acronyms, call signs, and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. And so you started off this night out on the town at the O Club?
At the Officers Club at Naval Air
Okay.
Station in Miramar.
Okay, which has a reputation of its own.
It does indeed.
And so I assume at that point, had the filming already been completed, or were they in the before the filming, or somewhere in the middle?
It's right in the middle of the filming.
Right in the filming. So you were still giving them some
Correct.
Just knowledge about what it's like to be a fighter pilot, too.
Right. And they ate it up. They loved, because they had already been exposed to flying the airplane, and I think they were about 50% done with the filming. They knew the storyline, what that was going to end up to be.
Mm-hmm.
And they just had all kinds of, now they had a little knowledge, which is a very dangerous thing. They could use the acronyms, use the principles, and that's what they wanted to talk about. It was war stories, some of our experiences in Vietnam. Coincidentally, the advisor, Pete Pettigrew, the real Viper, he flew with my squadron in Vietnam, and he shot down a MiG-21 as one of the two pilots in my squadron that each got a MiG-21.
Right. Well, so were you guys any influence to the infamous O Club scene where Tom meets Kelly McGillis' character?
A little bit, because it was actually...
You're not going to admit it, are you?
It was actually in the room it's a smaller bar off the main lounge that's called the Wax-Off room. The term Wax-Off is an acronym for weather obscured ceiling and visibility zero. And that's the name of the bar. But it's very small, and it has a very small dance floor where we had some local female performers perform in the past. And so the singing of the song was a little hokey, but it got the point across.
But it made great movie content.
It did. And it carried through to Top Gun Maverick.
Well, and so when the movie came out, you went to see the movie, of course.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, then my squadron at the time, I was in VF 213, Fighter Squadron, the Black Lions, and I was back flying Phantoms at that point, because my career worked out where I started flying F-4 Phantoms, did a tour in Vietnam, and then went to Top Gun myself as a student and graduated. And shortly thereafter, I was assigned to fly F-14s and go to an instructor squadron, VF 124 gunfighters. And however, at my 10-year mark, I decided to resign my regular commission and join the reserves and fly in the reserves. And the reserves, however, at Miramar are flying F-4s again. So I transitioned back to the old war horse, the workhorse of the Vietnam War.
Mm-hmm. So tell me about going to the theaters and seeing the movie.
Well, we got the whole squadron to one of the cornerstones of naval aviation is the camaraderie of the squadrons. And I'm sure the Air Force has the same camaraderie that we do. And you're always following the skipper's lead, the commanding officer's lead. And he said, we're going as a squadron. We don't have to wear our flight suits, but everybody's going to wear their helmet. So we made sure we got to the theater early So here you have about 15 aviators sitting in the front row at a theater with these helmets on. And we didn't block anybody's view, but we got a round of applause when we walked in.
So the people that were there in the theater, they recognized that you were
They
all
did.
naval aviators.
They did.
And I'm sure you were not shy about,
No.
letting them know that.
Not a bit.
Fighter pilots generally aren't shy about letting people know they're fighter pilots.
That's true.
So you went and saw the movie. What were your impressions of the first movie?
It was unbelievable. I'd never seen a movie like that with the spectacular photography. I mean, that was the thing that jumped out right away. The air-to-air photography being as accurate as it was and filmed as professionally as it was in a different category of success, because that immediately gave it credibility to knuckleheads like me and the rest of the squadrons. Go, hey, that was pretty good. And we personally knew all of the aggressor pilots that were in the airplane, supposedly as bad guys. But so we knew them, and they had talked to us before at our visits with them at the club about what they experienced in the filming and what was good and what was bad. There is a little bit of comment, of course, about some of the low altitude maneuvering because of realizing it's a work of art as a movie. Those altitudes are very unrealistic and illegal. But you package it in, well, you're in combat and there are no rules. So, but it was pretty spectacular stuff. And you could tell at that point in 1985, 86, that it was not computer generated, because we didn't have a big computer presence in that era.
Well, that's great. So you and I got to go see Top Gun Maverick together. And what did you think of the sequel?
Probably 10 times better. I mean, it was
It was better than the original.
I think so. However, now with the Top Gun Maverick, they are able to incorporate some pretty sophisticated adjustments through a computer generated programs that are unbelievably realistic. I mean, I think I commented to you as we were leaving the theater saying this is a great movie, but they had to modify a few laws of physics in the generation of some of those maneuvers and some of those scenes. But it worked out perfectly.
Well, they had more aerial footage and more aircraft involved and a lot more actual flying in Top Gun Maverick than they did the original. So what did you think of the flying aspects?
It still was pretty spectacular. The F-18 Hornet is a wonderful aircraft. That was the replacement for the F-14 Tomcat. Tomcat was the star of Top Gun 1, and the Hornet is Top Gun 2, because that is still the mainstream fighter aircraft in the Navy. And it's a combined multi-mission aircraft with fighter pilot capability, which is dogfighting type environment, and it's very good at that. And also it's an attack aircraft with very sophisticated computer systems for getting bombs on target.
Which is what they did in the movie.
They did. And also recognizing the technology enhances the survivability of our pilots, because they are able to go back to the aircraft carrier at night when a pitching deck is going on in crummy weather, and they press a few buttons, take their hands off the stick and throttle, and the plane lands very safely.
Wow. But your Tomcat made an appearance in the second movie too.
I know. And the good part is I have several friends that I'm still in communication with that I flew with that were roommates on cruises, and none of them had seen the movie yet. I said, but I'm not telling you the ending. I'm just not going to tell you the ending, because for people that flew the F-14 and appreciated the first Top Gun as much as we all did, that is because it's unexpected. But it instantaneously, there's a connection to it, because myself included, I delivered an aircraft to Iran. There's only one country that F-14s were sold to besides the United States, and that's Iran. And as soon as I saw the plane, they had not said what country they were in. So Iran. And I also had flown I was designated when I was a flight instructor in the F-14s to be an instructor for Iranian air crews. So I flew with an Iranian pilot for about 6 months and got to know him very well, very, very good pilot. And, unfortunately, he didn't do very well in the revolution. But there are still F-14s flying today in Iran. Not many, but they're flying.
And they've been retired out of the U.S. Navy.
Yes, since 2006.
Okay. Well, that's great. Any final thoughts about Top Gun 1, Top Gun 2?
Well, I think I joked with you as we left the theater. I think I said, hey, there's going to be a Top Gun 3, but it's going to be Maverick takes over the old person's home. But it's quite a franchise of wonderful action movies that keeps you totally entertained. I couldn't wish it more success because they did such a spectacular job.
Well, that's great. I enjoyed it as well. I had some questions about some of the tactics and other kinds of things that most of our listeners probably don't want me to drone on about. But certainly as a piece of entertainment, it was wonderful. Great story, a lot of amazing visuals with the flying, and just had a great time. And I appreciate the opportunity to see it with you.
Well, you always want to ask questions, but you're so engrossed in the movie, we didn't have time.
Well, when it comes out on DVD,
That's right.
We'll watch it again and we'll stop it.
Absolutely.
And the movie will take 4 hours to get through because we're stopping and talking and telling stories.
I've done that before.
That'll be the fun part.
Yeah.
All right, so I want to do kind of the other part of our conversation and talk to you about your Vietnam experience, a little bit about the rest of your career in the Navy, and then talk about any lessons learned or perspectives that you have now, 50 years after the war, that might be different or the same as the perspectives you had when you were in combat. Okay, so why don't we just start a little bit about how you came into the Navy and how you ended up in Vietnam.
Well, I went to a liberal arts college in Pennsylvania from 1964 to 1968. And considering the fact that the United States was involved in the conflict in Vietnam in that era, to support that conflict and the number of people necessary, the draft was in effect. And the draft was very, very specific about who got deferments and who didn't. And one of the deferments was college education, or actively pursuing a degree in an accredited college. And so it kept us out of the draft, realizing the draft was oriented towards people that went only into the Army. And then there was a bit of a draft for the Marine Corps, but only those two services. They drafted no one into the Air Force and drafted no one into the Navy. And you were at risk if you failed out of college or graduated. They notify your local draft board very, very quickly. So knowing that and knowing the fact that recruiters came to the campuses looking for people that are interested in, and any college, accredited college, is a target-rich environment for people that fit the profile of being capable of qualifying in aircraft and things of that nature. So they came to our campus. I guess my junior year, you took some tests, and they would give you an instantaneous, answer in a piece of paper saying, okay, you're qualified to do this, this, and this, if you choose to. Let me back up a moment. My father was in the Navy in World War II, and he fought in the Pacific. And so my whole youth growing up, he would tell stories about the Navy, and he would tell me he was what we call a black shoe. He was a surface warfare officer. However, every story was always backed up with, and these aviators, these fighter pilots, these attack pilots flying off the carriers, they were the guys that won the war. So you get all of that type of brainwashing in a positive sense about what the Navy had to offer. So the Navy recruiter was the first one on campus before the other services arrived. And so I was obviously going to be oriented towards the Navy, and I was. And so they told me that you passed for a certain level. You just have to make a decision now if you want when you would like to start. Now everything's based on your graduation, and being the brilliant college student I was, I had to spend an extra 6 months in college to graduate. So I squeezed 4 years into 4.5, and so I had to work closely with the recruiter to get a certified in-shop date, because that would be turned over to the draft board. So you were always looking to get the draft board potentially off your back, and you didn't want to be in that. This is before the lottery, if you recall. Well, your generation didn't have to deal with that lottery, but that scared the hell out of people too. So they gave me a date to start in April 1969 to report down to Pensacola. And my father was able to swear me in as an aviation officer candidate. And we reported to Pensacola. A good friend of mine, we were able to my father was able to pull a few strings so we could be in the same class. Now, Aviation Officer Candidate School, AOCS, is run by Marine Corps drill instructors. And I can tell you right now the names of my drill instructors, and it's 54 years later. Sergeant Godwin and Gunnery Sergeant Shewitt, the most angry, inspiring men you'd ever want to meet in your life. And over a 16-week period, we started our AOCS class with about 45 students. And 16 weeks later, we had 21. And that's the attrition rate. But the attrition rate is based on something called DOR, which means drop on request. Those are the magic words. If you simply cannot take any more of what they're trying to instill in you, you can just simply say, I DOR, and then there are no more questions asked, you're out. However, your draft board was immediately notified. And so from that position, you were very focused and motivated to be as successful as you could during that time. Now, coming from a non-military existence college, a co-ed college in the mountains of Pennsylvania, what they put us through is something that altered every aspect of my life. And
it was transformative.
Absolutely transformative in my entire future. Understanding how the day it started, April 22nd, 1969, I walk through the door. There's a drill instructor standing on the porch of the barracks, and he says, "Sir, can I help you with your luggage?" I go, no, I can carry it in. Well, as soon as I crossed the line, the threshold in that building, he started screaming at me with every curse word you possibly can. He said, "Who do you think you are?" Asking a Marine Corps drill instructor. He says, "I want you to go up to the second floor, open that bag, and throw every bit of clothes out the window. And then come back here, pick it all up, and then do it again and again." So needless to say, these are kind of shocks to your system on the first hour that you're in aviation officer candidate school. But it had a focus, and the focus was to weed out any potential people they really didn't want to invest any more money on, because it got progressively more flying. We didn't do any flying in that 16 weeks. We did do a lot of academics, but it was mostly physical training, marching, listening to drill instructors, who in reality are absolutely brilliant judges of character and attitude. And these were all veterans from Vietnam, and most of them were significant veterans from Khe Sanh, which is the largest battle the Marine Corps fought in Vietnam.
Well, they had a very specific job in 16 weeks.
They did. And that was to mold into a Navy ensign, this person that is coming out of college and has no idea of the military, what it's about.
So
And they do
physical
it.
conditioning, mental testing, academic aptitude,
Correct.
and leadership. So
Correct.
they had to turn you from a civilian into a naval officer,
Right.
in 16 weeks.
They did. And one of your first acts after you receive your commission is you render your first salute. Now, it's always to your drill instructor, because it's tradition in the U.S. Navy that after your first salute, you give the person who saluted you, and then you return the salute, you give them $1. It has to be a silver dollar. And so the drill instructors, every commissioning class, the drill instructors are your drill instructors, that first salute, they end up with $40, $50 right there on the scene. So that's a tradition that was enforced and encouraged, and you were so happy to do it.
And so once you got your bars,
Right.
you were commissioned naval ensign,
Correct.
and you were identified as being on a flight training path.
Correct.
Okay, so you went to flight school?
I did. You had a certain amount. You had about 4 months of flight school at Naval Air Station Pensacola, the base you were already at, which is the cradle of naval aviation. And you would start with a lot of the basics, and then you start flying basic airplane. We flew a UC-45J, which we affectionately call the bug smasher, because it really couldn't go much faster than a bug. But a World War II era twin prop engine, very slow aircraft. And a lot of that was to learn navigation skills, some very, very basic radar skills, but general orientation. Again, testing you throughout the program to see if you're the quality of individual that will be successful. They want you to be successful, because now we're getting into the big dollars. Then we transitioned to twin seat jet engines for low-level navigation, which is a whole different world. Going 360 miles an hour, which conveniently is 6 miles a minute, because that helps you in ground navigation to identify. This is a whole new world of low altitude. And so that's an eye-opener. But they're also trying to decide now, what type of Navy aircraft do we think this person is best suited for? Because out of flight school at that point, you could have gone in a direction of, I think it was 7 or 8 different types of aircraft, including helicopters. Well, that got out of the system pretty quick as far as my team were concerned. So we were competing with each other in this one particular unit academically and flight training. You had every single flight was graded and rated, and you were debriefed every single flight. And now you started appearing in relation to your fellow students, because they have what they call selection night, if you will, where just because you have, let's say arbitrarily, 50 students they have got to place, they may not have 50 billets. They have their system knows exactly how many they can put into this end of the sausage maker, and because we need that many to come out the other end. Well, that might not be 50. So the top, they might break it down as, okay, we have 10 billets to fly fighters. We have 2 billets to fly A6s. We have 5 billets to fly RA-5C vigilantes. And so they go down the list, and it's purely academic and flight performance. Who gets number one? And what I wanted, you also had to pick a coast. The Navy really is 2 navies. We have the Atlantic Coast Fleet, and we have the Pacific Coast Fleet. Very similar in a lot of ways, but very different in other ways. And growing up in New York City and going to school in Pennsylvania and not doing very much traveling in my life at that point, I really, really wanted to go to San Diego. And so I knew I had to get some pretty good grades. So I ended up second in my class and was able to pick San Diego and fly fighters, F4s, knowing that during the Vietnam era, the Vietnam War in particular, we really only sent West Coast squadrons to Vietnam initially. You know, during the final 1972 invasion from the north, we did start sending some East Coast aircraft carriers. But traditionally, the East Coast carriers would go to the Mediterranean. And that used to always be the joke among the West Coast fighter guys and the East Coast fighter guys. You're going to Mallorca, you're going to Germany, and we're going to Hanoi and Haiphong. But we were very proud of that. And so that going to California was just an absolute dream.
So out of flight school, you chose to be a fighter pilot.
Yes.
Based on the West Coast.
Correct.
So you knew higher than average likelihood that once you were done with fighter training, you were going to be in a squadron headed to serve in Vietnam.
That's correct.
Okay, so you did your fighter training for the F-4.
Correct.
Okay, and so you arrived at a squadron in San Diego, or was the squadron already deployed, or how did you get to the coast of Vietnam?
As soon as I received my wings, my certification, we call it NATOPS qualification, in December 1970. They gave me a 3-year set of orders to VF-114, the aardvarks. And that was the logo on the tail. If you remember way back, there used to be a comic strip called Zot, which had this orange aardvark. And that was a squadron. You had no selection over that. That was the Bureau of Naval Personnel. They filled the slots. You're going to go to F-4 Phantom Squadron, and it's going to be in San Diego, but you can't pick the squadron because there were some very, very good squadrons and then some very average squadrons. So they don't leave it up to us. So I got sent to VF-114, and they had just returned from Vietnam. They had just come off a 9-month deployment to Vietnam. And they were in their what they call a stand-down period. After you return from combat flying in Vietnam, you would typically get a month off. And it's not just for you flyers. I mean, the real people that need the time off are the troops, the men only at the time. There were no women in the Navy at that point that were involved in combat and on ships. So coming off the USS Kitty Hawk is the ship that VF-114 always flew off of in that era. And she's no longer with us. She's a matter of fact, she was sold for $1 and is being dismantled right now as we speak. And she'd been decommissioned years ago.
So you end up with the aardvarks. They were just returning from a 9-month cruise. So did you spend that 9 months in San Diego, and you're talking to squadron mates who now have wartime flying experience?
They had already returned. And I'm in the squadron, and they're bringing in the new. The turnover in a squadron like that is about 20%, 25% every year at the lower ranks. And I was a lieutenant junior grade at that point, so now I was an O2, and lieutenant junior grades know everything. They are the fountain of knowledge. Especially when they go to the skipper and they're getting ready to go fly, and you tell the skipper, "Hey, skipper, watch this." that makes skippers very nervous.
Which usually is followed by something incredibly stupid.
That's right. Well, the other 3 words that commanding officers don't like to hear is, "in my experience." So, yes, and you're getting all the war stories now about what liberty is like in the Philippines, what liberty is like in Hong Kong. There's kind of a standard package when you fly in the Pacific. All the carriers, the main operating base was QB Point, Philippines, which is Subic Bay. There are 2 stations next to each other. It serves the entire 7th Fleet. It serves submarines. It services surface combatants like cruisers and destroyers and battleships when we had them, but a very significant base, one of the largest Navy installations in the world. And so you'd always, that was your main target, but they would also go to the side, Hollywood ports, Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan. And so you get a little bit of flavor of join the Navy and to see the world. You would. But it was Philippines, 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 time and time again. And so you got the war stories from back in San Diego about what the Philippines was like, what the flying was like, and how the rules change. And the Philippines in general is a very, very beautiful country. It's very heavily, excuse me, very heavily wooded and a lot of vegetation, beautiful sand beaches, and flying around there is very exciting. So you get all of these stories, but you're also getting built in there because as your training started, you know, you do a walk before you run concept where you do some very basic, very slow action types of flying in the fighter Phantom, the F-4 Phantom, interspersed with a few terrifying moments that are going to happen at some point, but you're learning from these experienced pilots. And they would put you in situations where it was most advantageous to pay attention because it really is the voice of experience. And I can honestly say I learned more about fighter aviation in the officers club than I did in the airplane because that's where you had your mentoring, your mentors in a relaxed environment talking to you about the different things. So now as they started seeing your performance in the airplane, they knew what to talk to you about. You know, safety is a big issue. However, safety is not, even though every commanding officer starts out, you know, any period of training with safety is our biggest concern. No, it's not. Our biggest concern is to win our wars quickly and decisively. That's what we're here for, okay? But in a peacetime environment, training environment, you know, you don't need to lose any assets, people or aircraft, and we don't. But you're getting some of the best education in aviation as you possibly can get from these experienced pilots. Some of them, at that point, people like me in that group had 0 combat missions. And all the guys I flew with had 350 combat missions. And in Vietnam, you know, there are it's really like 3 different wars. You had the wars, the part of the war where you couldn't bomb or fly above a certain geographical area. You couldn't go after this huge list of targets. You couldn't bomb. You couldn't win because it was the political environment that's involved. And then there's like 1972 where it was Katie bar the door. We're going up and we're going downtown every day. We're going to Hanoi. We're going to Haiphong. We're going after power plants. We're going after railroads. We're going after all the stuff that was unable to touch when the war was controlled by the administration that was in office in the mid 1960s.
So you started off really learning to fly a fighter,
Right.
And what Vietnam was like in the Philippines. When did the ship head back to Vietnam? When did you start flying combat missions?
Navy aircraft carriers with their air wing, when you're married together, understanding you've got the 5,000 man ship company, their mission is to do the mission of the air wing. Now, the air wing is about 90 aircraft with 7 squadrons, and that is about, counting the enlisted men, it's probably like 800 people in a 5,000 man crew. But the reality is, in actual combat, only about 100 people, the pilots and the air crews, see combat. And everybody else on that ship is designed to support the mission and accomplish the mission. Excuse me. So we were in a sequence of training where you get graded. Before you can go to combat, you have to convince the upper commands that you are mechanically capable, you are education-wise, you have everything up to date. It's a massive checklist of education opportunities and performance working as a team, getting day traps on the ship, getting night traps, working for 24 hours straight. All this testing to certify that you are eligible to go to combat. And one of the final approval processes is called the ORI, Operational Readiness Inspection, which is a big deal. And you train for it. You have to pass several tests academically, both you and the enlisted men. And so it's a big deal. And you have a lot of advance warning when it's going to take place. And it takes place at sea. Well, they show up one Monday morning at the ship. We weren't supposed to go to Vietnam for about a month and a half, but we were going to go into this big ORI exercise starting that day, because this is a 2-week evolution at sea. And captain comes on the 1MC and says, attention, Kitty Hawk sailors, we have a change of plans. We're leaving for Vietnam in 3 days instead of a month and a half. And we are canceling the ORI. You are fully qualified to go to Vietnam. Now, the chaos that announcement is astronomical, considering the fact that most of the ship's company, the ship's crew, are enlisted men. And some of them are very young, 18, 19 years old. They're newly married in a lot of cases. Wife is pregnant. And while they're going to go on what was predicted to be an 8-month cruise, it ended up being a 10-month cruise. A lot of these young married people would want the wives to live someplace else, like with their families, other places, because the way the system worked is there'd be a lot of leave given out the 2 weeks before you'd go on cruise, so you could get your family settled, you can move people around, you can do all that kind of stuff. Now you have 3-day notice. And so that was an absolute catastrophe. And as the captain said, we're giving everybody on the ship 3 days leave, except the duty crews that have to be here, because we have to go there at full speed. And when you go at full speed, you go with other ships, because they're part of the battle group. The battle group deploys. Mm-hmm. Back then, I think our battle group was like 9 ships. Destroyers, cruisers, submarines, which you never know where they are. But we did go out at full speed, which is about 30 knots.
And you were headed for Hawaii first?
We normally go to Hawaii, but we bypassed Hawaii. And we got the word. Once the ship left port and we could start holding secret all-officer meetings, they said they have intelligence that the North Vietnamese are building up the forces at the DMZ, and it looks like there's an invasion coming. Now, this is February of 1972. And so we rocket over so fast that a carrier is a normally very stable platform. However, in the Northern Pacific, it tends to be very, very heavy weather and very heavy seas. And the ship, when you're going a speed of 30 knots, there is a lot more movement on the ship, and it's what they call a Dutch roll. And so it's doing up and down, and it's doing right and left. And it's extremely nausea-inducing. Well, we've got a lot of new people on the ship, a lot of young men who have never been on cruise before. And literally thousands of them got very sick and were vomiting in all the heads, which are Navy restrooms. And they couldn't do anything. The ship itself, a 1,000-foot long attack aircraft carrier, smelled of vomit for 2 weeks. And the aviators handled it pretty well, but it was just very difficult for the younger junior troops to go through that experience. As a matter of fact, one of the destroyers that was an escort for us, it cracked its hull, and it had to divert to Hawaii. because it was going through too much rough seas to keep up with the carrier.
Wow.
But that was an experience. So we bypassed that, but we did stop in the Philippines. And when we stopped in the Philippines, it was just for just 3 days, which is not enough time to really have a good time. But what's going on in the ship, the enlisted men are loading up, hundreds and thousands of tons of bombs and hundreds of thousands of tons of jet fuel, and they're, getting us combat ready. And they did it in 3 days. These kids worked around the clock. Now, understanding in the Navy that by the book, you're an officer first and you're an aviator second. Well, in our own little fraternity, our number one job is to keep our butts alive and fly where the most fun is and do it safely as you can. Well, the job I had, you had to have a secondary job to, implement your leadership skills and have them mature, because the Navy policy, however defective it was we want everybody to be an admiral someday. But you got to go through these little hoops up the way. You can't do the next one unless you did the other one. And so leadership was number one. So as a lieutenant junior grade with no experience on a ship or whatever, I became the branch officer for the electric department, I had 15 enlisted men that worked on the electrical system in the F-4 Phantom. And I had 2 chief petty officers who, if you're a smart lieutenant junior grade, you worship in a very professional way your chief petty officers who have 20 years experience doing this stuff, and take their advice. Don't pull rank on them, and listen to them, what they say, and they'll get you through it, because a lot of the other enlisted men were 18-year-old young men. Some did not have high school educations or a complete high school education, and they wanted to have fun. And they heard the war stories too about how much fun it was going to be, and they tended to get themselves in trouble occasionally. And so this is what you had to do. You're writing evaluations on them. You're making sure they show up on time. We have something called captain's mast. So the skipper of my fighter squadron has an official legal capacity for any enlisted man who violates either the UCMJ code of conduct or something, or has missed the movement of the ship, all of a sudden didn't show up from liberty, or any number of things. And it's non-judicial punishment, I think they call it. And it's fairly minor, but it's very official, and it tends to scare the hell out of people, especially junior officers who have to show up and explain to the skipper how great this kid is. Because some of these kids get themselves in some unbelievable situations with alcohol and women of the evening in foreign ports. So that's your job, is to be a leader of these men and listen to the chiefs and learn from everybody. And then you would move up into the different other positions. In addition to this environment, so I've already talked about flying. I'm talking about other activity with my enlisted men, but also I had responsibility on the ship. As a junior officer, you're now part of the ship's company. Your air wing is part of the ship's company, so you have to supply people to the ship to do things, and they have certain watches. When you're traveling across either the Atlantic or the Pacific in an aircraft carrier, and you don't fly, there's no flying. When you want to get from point A to point B, flying is stopped. But you have to do that judiciously, because the aviators will come out of qualification for day flying and night flying, and it's a real tightrope balancing act to keep everybody qualified in case you got to start flying night missions. Now, you can't fly a night mission unless you're night qualled, and night qualled means you have at least 6 night arrested landings in the past 30 days. And so we have to provide junior officers typically for things called integrity watches. And these are 2-hour watches around the clock, 24-hour clock, where you're on the flight deck control, okay, day or night, and all the junior guys are in the middle of the night. Classic is the watches go from 2400 to 0200, 200 to 400, 400 to 600. Those are the worst. What you're doing is you're on the ship. You've got a couple of enlisted men that are working for you that are also on duty. And every 30 minutes, you're walking around the flight deck, counting the chains that are on the ships, especially if the weather has gone to a certain condition. Make sure everything is okay on the flight deck, and you write it in the log. This is how you revert back to the old nautical school of iron men and wooden ships, and your tracking of everything in logs. And it is mind-boggling the things you have to get involved. You get mail off. You have to be a mail officer. You have alert fives. Once we do get into the environment of hostilities, we have to have two fighters fully manned, 2 people on the catapult, and has to be launched in 5 minutes. It's called alert 5. Then we have 2 more airplanes. You got 2 fighter squadrons on the ship. Each squadron will provide a crew around the clock when they're not flying. Normally you're flying 12 hours on, 12 hours off. But you're sitting in the cockpit, strapped in, engine's not turning, and you're just saying, I hope I don't have to do this. But all of a sudden when you feel the ship starting to turn into the wind, they're going to launch the alert 5 for whatever reason. Sometimes it's just to test the system. Other times they see something. They're off the coast of North Vietnam and they see something and want you to go check it out. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, 2 minutes ago, you have a pillow with you, got the canopy down, and you're kind of catching a few Z's. But then all of a sudden, the world lights up and you're going flying. So that's another requirement you have to provide for the ship's company, the protection of the aircraft carrier, which is a very vulnerable ship.
So you learned a lot, had a lot of different responsibilities on the way to the Philippines and then Philippines to Vietnam.
Right.
When did the ship arrive in Vietnam?
I flew my very first combat mission March 9th of 1972. And we arrived that day. We arrived the night before. From the Philippines to Vietnam was only about a day and a half trip. Now, what they did is, let me back up a second and talk about the other part of our education from the United States to the Philippines. That's about a 10-day period. We were getting constant briefs. Now here's where we're getting the intelligence briefs about everything, about the enemy, about their equipment, what their intentions are, what the Navy thinks their intentions are. So now you're getting all the secret stuff. And you're getting a lot of special equipment, how to handle code word cards of the day, what happens if you get shot down, how you're going to handle going to certain places, doing certain things that will get you picked up. And so interacting with the whole system now. And that was extremely educational because you never heard this stuff before. You didn't have to. So Philippines.
Now it's real.
Now it's real. And because you already had stories about who and what was going on. We knew when an airplane got shot down. And in a 3-year period, the Navy, let me just check my numbers. In a 3-year period, we lost 350 aircraft in a 3-year period, shot down by the enemy, not mechanical. And the combined total, that's just the Navy, the combined total for the Navy, Marine Corps, and Air Force was 2,300 aircraft were lost in that 3-year period. And so with those numbers involved, you now realize it was real. We have to, be smart and do the right thing and go to the right place. And you're also dropping a lot of very heavy ordnance.
So let's go back to that very first combat mission. What was the mission?
Well, what they, thank God they did it this way, is they would, off Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin, there were 2 stations. One was called Yankee Station up north, and one was called Dixie Station down south. And the down south station would exclusively do flight operations in South Vietnam. Even though all of Vietnam was incredibly dangerous, I mean, getting shot at by not only bad guys, but good guys, people, everybody had guns. It was just, you had to be on your toes whenever you flew over Vietnam. However, South Vietnam was a bit of a safe haven because of, there was a lot of, not a lot of activity from the NVA, which was the North Vietnamese Army. There was a lot of activity with Viet Cong, which were guerrillas. They were two separate armies. And so in South Vietnam, you didn't face, there were no surface-to-air missiles initially. The SA-2, the guideline. There were none of those. There was some AAA, which is anti-aircraft artillery, the higher calibers. Normally it was 23 millimeter and 37 millimeter, but not the higher ones, and no radar-guided type AAA. And you had machine guns, which are very inaccurate and very difficult to shoot down an airplane. So they started us out for 5 days of flying missions only in South Vietnam, being work with a forward air control. The forward air controllers were Army and Air Force primarily, and they were good. These are guys that would fly propeller-driven Cessnas at 1,000 feet, and they would see in the jungle all kinds of activity in the areas that they would send them to that needed to be dealt with. And these guys would mark a target, and the F-4 carried 6 Mark 82s, which were 500-pound bombs. We carried 3,000 pounds of bombs. We knew how to bomb. We had trained to it. It's a little different in combat. We had a policy where in training, we would drop 1 bomb at a time so we could get the technique down. In Vietnam, you get a confirmed target and you drop all 6 at the same time and you get out of there because, the multiple run environment of being predictable is one of the main ways to get shot down or get shot up or both. So we did South Vietnam for about 5 days. Everybody in the air wing, all the different squadrons are doing their missions, but they're doing it in South Vietnam. And then we started moving up a little bit. The ship started moving up towards Yankee Station, which is pretty much off of Haiphong, but about 75 miles in the Gulf of Tonkin. And so we were only bombing in the southern environment of North Vietnam, and which is still not too many surface-to-air missiles and no MiGs, no MiG aircraft. And in South Vietnam, there were really never any MiGs until after the war. And so now you started going up in risk as to what you were doing. And that's then on Easter Sunday, 1972, which was March 30th, the North Vietnamese decided to invade the South. And they had 200,000 troops and 350 tanks came over the border now. So now we've got and this is the reason we left port a month and a half early, because this is what was predicted. Now they were coming over the demilitarized zone into the northern part of South Vietnam on the coast, Quang Tri, Hue, Dong Ha, all of these different communities, and they were starting. That's where I saw my first, basically, Red Chinese tank. Now, tanks are very vulnerable to bombing, and however, bombing for an F-4 fighter crew is not our forte. We're very fortunate if our bombs hit the ground, but the accuracy in the F-4 Phantom, because of the bombing system that it had, was very primitive and not very accurate. The people that had the great bombing systems were the A-7s, the A-4s, the A-6s. They're attack aircraft. When you have attack in your name, attack squadron, you're a bomber. If you have fighter squadron, you're a fighter. you fight other airplanes primarily. But they found out very, very early that the F-4 Phantom was a very versatile aircraft. And in Vietnam, we basically had a dozen different missions. Bombing, which we hated because it added 6,000 pounds roughly to the, or 3,000 pounds to the aircraft. And our number one concern, 24 hours a day flying fighters, is gas, fuel, and afterburner. Afterburner, we take on 25,000 pounds of fuel, but if you left your afterburner on for 9 minutes, you have no more fuel. But you don't leave your afterburner on for 9 minutes. So we're always looking for the tanker. We're always concerned about weight. We're concerned about all that stuff. So it's a constant battle of the environment that is going to hamper the mission. And so
let's go back and just recap a couple of things because that's a lot of background. So if you can just briefly recount when you first got there, you were eased into your combat missions by going into South Vietnam, where there was some threat, but it was not as complex. And then as you started moving further north, the risk increased.
correct.
Okay, so if you can just recap that a little.
We started implementing after the invasion from the north over the DMZ with this massive amount of troops and armor. We went to a traditional role of interdiction of the supplies that were going to these troops in the south. And we would do that via alpha strikes. An alpha strike would have typically 25 aircraft in it, all varieties, electronic jammers, attack A6s, attack A7s, and fighters to protect them. And we'd all have a separate mission, but we'd all have one target. Like this is a petroleum storage area. And these are typical throwback World War II type targets that you had to get because by destroying the infrastructure and the supply line that has been proven, the logistics destroys armies. Without supplies, they're doomed. And so we would go after those types of targets in a big way, but that's when they started shooting some really big stuff at us because now we're bombing their country. But it was not like dealing in South Vietnam where we were dealing with a forward air controller who had a target of opportunity and said, go do it. And you knew there were no missiles to come back at you. This was, you're going after that storage area, you're going after that fighter base. And so you had that destination. Well, it helped us in a way that we knew where we were going, but the North Vietnamese knew where we were coming from. So they would over protect these high value targets. So when you got in the area of the target, they knew where you were going. They would basically have a 3-tier level of anti-aircraft artillery, surface-to-air missiles, 2 different kinds of surface-to-air missiles, and a third one showed up, a man-pad missile, which is a handheld missile, not very effective against high-altitude fighters, but effective against the low guys. And it was kind of chaotic, to say the least, with trying to, their tactic of shooting up the missiles after the AAA went off was designed to get you to drop your bomb someplace else or just get so disorganized you couldn't hit the target or drive you down, because the defense against a surface-to-air missile is you have to see it. And you can. They're very, very obvious. I mean, the lifting off from the launch zones, it was just dust and plumes, and you could see it. And the way you picked it up is you'd look at it. Now, there are multiple missiles coming up, but you have to figure out which one is coming to you. And you had indicators in your cockpit were kind of brought in. They don't guarantee it's just coming to you. They're guaranteeing that certain electronic spectrum is in the area, and these are guidance signals. So what you would do is you would see this missile come up, and you would wait, and you'd move your nose. You say you pull your nose up. Now, if you see the missile do that, pull lead on you, and you drop your nose, and it does that, that's on you. Now, here's how you have to defeat the missile. You wait, you watch it, because what happens, the SA-2 is a two-stage missile. Drops off the first stage, that gets it going real fast. Now, the next portion is called the flying telephone pole, because that's what the size of it is, and it's coming up really fast, Mach 5. And so you put it at your 2 o'clock or 10 o'clock, and as soon as you can see the black nose of this rocket exhaust, you turn into it as hard as you can. Now, that sounds anti-intuitive, pulling into the missile, but see, it can't. It has to pull lead to hit you. And so that is what it does. It pulls lead, and then it hopes the 300-pound warhead either hits you directly, or I've seen them break in half. They can't handle the turn. They'll try to handle the turn. You have to understand, all of these, almost all of these missile sites are being manned and controlled by Russians or Soviet bloc countries. Ironically, in my volunteer work at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, this was 4 years ago, I had an individual, kind of about my age, come up to me at the window, and I would wear my wings and induce conversations among visitors. And this gentleman had a bit of an accent, and he says, he wanted to shake my hand, and we started talking a little bit. And he says, I'm from Czechoslovakia. He said, and I shot missiles at you. So that was very interesting. He banned one of those vans, and a little sidebar story, but that's where it got very difficult. Now, we still had restrictions from the administration, from Washington, about things we couldn't do. But I mean, as far as we were concerned, we were in a full-blown environment. Then the Nixon administration was a lot more lenient, if you will, about the political structure, and they wanted to apply as much pressure as they possibly could. And that was what we call the summer of '72, that we did a lot of that work there.
So I want to go back just a little bit and talk about your combat missions here. So, when you were going through those first couple of combat missions in the South, when you started moving north and the risk really went up, what goes through your mind when you're on a combat mission like that? What are you thinking? Are you scared? Are you excited? A little bit of both? Kind of talk me through what's going through your head as a naval fighter pilot, the best stick in the air, and you're going to go into one of these environments.
Well, you know where you're going. You've got the brief that morning, normally at about 4 o'clock in the morning, so you know exactly where you're going. But you start getting rumors the night before out of air intel where the target is. And, there were half a dozen targets that were hell on earth. I mean, it was unbelievably defended. That was Hanoi, parts of Haiphong, around some Kep airfields, different places. So you'd start just making sure you had all your shit together, and you had all your equipment. You double-checked everything to make sure if you were going to use it, your life preservers. So, and you're waiting for the actual man-up signal so you can get into your aircraft. Now, every one of these Alpha Strike missions, each of the squadrons had to provide a spare aircraft. Normally, say they would want 4 aircraft for my squadron. Now, my squadron only had 11 aircraft, so that's a big chunk of my squadron. So we would go man our aircraft, but we would man up 5 aircraft, because if one of these 4 primary guys that have bombs on them, have missiles on them, goes down mechanically, you got to send the other team, and it's called a spare. You have manned spares that are ready to go. And I can't tell you how many manned spares that I've flown that instead of taking your flight gear off and going back, you're out there flying. So I remember my very first combat hop up North Vietnam. We were going to a fairly highly defended area. So we go find the tanker, we take on the extra gas, and you're listening very intently. You've got some combat frequencies you can listen to just see what's going on. Try not to talk too much to jam the frequency. And as soon as now, after you finish tanking in the area you're tanking, you start heading towards North Vietnam. And at some point, this is summertime, 1972. It's very hazy, a lot. It's crummy weather, a lot. But you see North Vietnam for the first time. And it is just like you imagined with your maps and charts and, the briefs you receive from the intel. And so in my case, you had to identify feet wet or feet dry. And so you always announce when your feet dry. That means you're over the coast of North Vietnam, and then you're heading to your target. When right before we got to the target, a lot of AAA, you could pick that up. Those are the black puffs of smoke that they're shooting at you. But we're at an altitude of about 18,000 to 20,000 feet, where it's not real effective up at that high, but it can be. And so in my case, we start getting involved in a lot of people talking on the radio, because now we're looking for MiGs. We don't have any bombs on that mission. We are what they call a MiG cap. Cap after every mission is carrier air patrol. So MiG carrier air patrol. So we're looking for MiGs. So I heard all these guys talking about it, and a couple of guys got hit, minor hits. They didn't have to eject. But I was trying to talk. I couldn't talk. My mouth, my tongue was so dry, and so I couldn't. And so there's fear, but not fear of being killed or having to eject. That's not that fear. This is the fear of looking bad to your squadron mates or not doing your job, because they're unmerciful. I mean, you've got so many different cultures in these different types of squadrons, and you've got a mission up there. Your job is to fly over the target area as a MiG cap at about 600 knots, being ready. You're all armed up, ready to go, and it's shoot on sight. However, you have to confirm that it's a bad guy, because there's so many American airplanes out there right there in that second, and sometimes some Air Force aircraft would show up for whatever reason. And so you had to make sure it was a bad guy. Well, you knew if there were MiGs in your area, because the other airplanes would be telling you. And so once you got involved in doing that kind of stuff, you tend to calm down. At least I did. But it is the fear of not doing your job. And as you did this for a few months, it did get easier and easier, but what started weighing on your mind is the political ramifications of what was going on around you. Meaning, the push for peace talks and that kind of thing, and the targets we were flying at, and the results we were getting, you really started questioning, is this worth it? And in reality, it was not. It was not worth it. We in the Navy, during a 3-year period, I said earlier that the Navy had lost over 300 aircraft. Well, they actually lost 532 aircraft in that 3-year period. In that environment, we had 644 aviators killed, missing, or POW. The total fixed wing loss, as I said, from all the services was over 2,400. And those things started playing on your mind, because, again, you're seeing the targeting and the fact that you're not being terribly effective with the type of tactics we had because of the air defenses they had. Realizing that at the height of the war in 1968, on the ground in Vietnam, South Vietnam, we had 536,000 troops. In 1972, We had 24,000. So that is a major. We were really not involved in that much combat in South Vietnam in 1972. We
On
were
the ground.
correct because there was a terminology out there, Vietnamization of the war. And so we were not involved very actively until they came over the border. When they invaded the South, well, we did get more involved in it, but a lot of our involvement was by our advisors. There were a lot more advisors than action combat troops. So that started creating a problem in your mind about is this whole thing worth it? Because we're getting out of here, and at best, it's going to be a neutral fight, and we lost 58,000 folks killed here.
Neutral outcome.
A neutral outcome. That was the best, Well, we figured that we knew the South Vietnamese government was corrupt and incompetent. We knew that. Well, that showed in 1975 when they basically gave up the country. But so that starts playing in your mind when you're flying these combat missions, because the first part of 1972, when we were flying up north, we were still restricted from hitting downtown Hanoi and downtown Haiphong. We were restricted from hitting airfields. We were restricted from, the big thing was restricted from mining the harbor. Every time you flew over Haiphong, either for a target in that area or to go to Hanoi, which was further west, about 125 miles, you would see a string of ships from third world countries, mostly Soviet bloc, unloading supplies. Easy targets that would, with our A7s and A4s and A6s, they would have been sunk. Or we could mine the harbors and then they couldn't get it in. We started mining in June of 1972 for the first time in the entire war, and of major ports. We had mined some things in the DMZ and areas like that, but that was minor compared to what could have been done.
Well, I know we talked about this before, so let's go back a little bit. I mean, you've talked about it a little bit, but talk about briefly, at a high level maybe, earlier in the war, there were military decisions made by the politicians, and that led to certain rules of engagement that really put our air crews in jeopardy.
Correct.
So altitude, target, time of day, avenue of approach, these were all restrictions that were created by politicians to try and get a political result out of the North. But they were restrictions that were put on military operations by the politicians. So if you could just kind of basically say the same thing I just said based on your experience.
A lot of the experience I had with what corruption was going on in our government of the handling of the war came well after the war with certain publications. And the number one publication after the Vietnam War was a book called Dereliction of Duty by H.R. McMaster, who is the past administration's national security advisor, retired four-star general and a very, very brilliant officer. He wrote this book as a major, and he told it as it was, and it was an indictment of the McNamara administration about how they handled the war and did not take it very seriously from their political standpoint. Every Tuesday, they would have a luncheon with the president, and they would pick targets, physical targets to hit. Now, these are non-military men at these Tuesday afternoon luncheons in the White House. Secretary of Defense would not be there. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff would not be there. Most of those meetings had not a military officer at the meeting. And they were picking targets arbitrarily based upon the concept that we really don't want to anger Russia, or China, who were both supporting North Vietnam. And from those meetings came a really string of lies and mischaracterizations. They would come to agreements in these luncheons and then tell the Secretary of Defense or the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff a completely different story. And again, found this out after the war. There was a policy at those meetings. There'd be a fairly senior representative from the State Department, which would not be unusual in my mind. However, once they agreed to the target list this week, the State Department representative would go back to the State Department and they would contact the government of Switzerland and tell them what the targets were. Because they had the philosophy that a neutral country is Switzerland, if there's a way to save innocent people that would be affected by peripheral damage from these target hits, we want to do it. Well, that's not what it did for us who are flying these missions. It simply prepared those targets to be heavily defended and to be able to strike much harder at American troops. I mean, we were being betrayed, by our own State Department. They thought they were doing good to save people. In reality, they were jeopardizing an awful lot of flyers.
So basically, you were being herded. When you were approaching the targets, you were being herded by these rules.
Correct. Some of the rules were good in the context, particularly with the VID. We had to identify. Early in the war, when we were striking up North Vietnam, there was some friendly, unfriendly fire that shot down airplanes because you had so many different organizations flying aircraft up in North Vietnam, some of them totally secret and totally unbeknownst to the other services, who, what, when, where, why. And so it created a problem. Now, you could not shoot an air-to-air missile at just a radar return. However, the problem is in the F-4 community, that's what they designed the missiles to be done. The weapons we had were designed to shoot down straight and level Soviet bombers coming for World War III at 15, 20 miles. Now you had to go take a look at the target and say, yeah, you'd have a code, MiG-17, MiG-21, MiG-23. So that was very, very limiting and very hampering. We couldn't use the weapons the way we wanted to. And we didn't have the resources in the Navy F-4s that the Air Force had. They had guns, first of all. Navy aircraft never had guns in the F-4 Phantom.
Didn't have them, or they just didn't put bullets in them?
Didn't have them. Not constructed. The only thing they had, you could put an outside pod on the wing of the F-4, and it was a machine gun. The reason,
Did not realize that.
The reason was the development of the radar, the air-to-air radar, and the Sparrow missile. And again, the mindset was Cold War, shoot down Russian bombers at range. They're non-maneuvering, they're very big. Well, now we put ourselves in an environment of air combat maneuvering, dogfighting, and bouncing around. Some of the first engagements we ever had with MiGs back in 1964, we'd have Navy aircraft, in one case, two airplanes shot 7 air-to-air missiles at 2 or 3 MiGs in dogfighting. Only one worked. And it didn't hit.
Because you're too close.
It's any number of things. And this may be discussed a little bit later, but that's one of the recommendations for the founding of Top Gun. They didn't take into consideration in the development of these air-to-air missiles that it was a maneuvering target. A maneuvering target is very difficult to hit. We learned how to do that, but we sacrificed so many missiles. We had a kill ratio in World War II in the Pacific of 19 to 1. We shot down 19 aircraft for every one that they shot down, air to air. In Vietnam, we had, prior to 1972, this is typically 66, 67, 68, 69. The kill ratio was 2 to 1. We only shot down 2 MiGs for every one of ours was shot down, air to air. We had a lot shot down surface to air, but air to air, and you had to take for that 2 to 1 kill ratio was across the board for Navy, Marine Corps, and Air Force. And I have a lot of sympathy for the Air Force because their fighter doctrine was so different than ours. First of all, they fought in 4s, 4 aircraft at a time. We only fought with 2 at a time. And they, particularly the F-105, was extremely vulnerable to air-to-air contact. And they lost a lot of F-105s, to MiGs. And that's why that kill ratio was only 2 to 1, which we weren't used to that. We even had in the Korean War, basically in the first 6 months, we almost wiped out the entire North Korean Air Force. It was 12 to 1. But we couldn't. We knew that. We knew that we had that ratio, and that if we got engaged, well, we also found out that keeping these missiles on the aircraft and doing catapults and arrested landings, it kind of beats up the electronics pretty well. Mm-hmm. And so that's another issue that came out of the development of Top Gun is you have to learn the systems and how to employ it in a maneuvering environment. And that's why in the summer of 72, we ended up, the Navy only, ended up with a 12 to 1 kill ratio at the end of the war. And Top Gun had been in existence at that point for 3 years.
Well, so how long were you there for your combat tour?
We got there first week in March, I guess it was, and we left third week in November. So it was a 10-month tour. And what was really kind of a bummer about it is the Navy dealt with hard schedules. It was designed to be 6 months, 6 months on cruise, and then 6 months to 10 months back in port training and getting the ship fixed. We kept getting increments of a month extension. As you get close to the time to go home, you're getting more excited. You kind of make plans with your life. You're doing things. And then 2 weeks before you would leave to go home, they said we're being extended a month. And they did that 3 times.
Well, so from March to November, you're flying combat missions. How many combat missions did you fly?
150.
150 in 8 months. That's
correct. I was flying 2 a day. You've seen my combat diary, 2 to 3 a day. In addition to doing those alert 5s, I mean, in that 8-month period, I lived in a room of 8 junior officers. It was a bunk room. In that entire 8 to 10-month period, I never got more than 2 hours of sleep successively without a phone ringing to get somebody to go up here and go do that. So it's an 8-man room. What did you expect? But we were young and indestructible, as you can imagine. But it
bounced back. So in that 8-month period, did you lose guys in your squadron?
Yes, we did. We lost the first crew. Was kind of a shocker for me because he was a very close friend. Joe Greenleaf and Clemmy McKinney was in his back seat, and they were. It was right after the North Vietnamese came over the border, and they were in bombing run. They were on a bombing run on some tanks and things. And the profile for the bombing run of an F-4 was a 40-degree dive angle, 400 knots, which accelerating to 600 knots, and then a release at 6,000 feet, and then pull up and out. And that still puts you in a AAA environment. Well, the target they were at, they had 5 AAA rounds strike the aircraft in the cockpit area. So when they hit the ground, crashed into the ground at 600 miles an hour, they were vaporized. And that it was an eye opener because he was one of us junior guys. You know, he was a good guy, both of them. And then through the summer, when we really started doing a lot of work in August, you went to bed at a normal time. In my case, it was when you could. So I wake up the next morning and I hear that the commanding officer had been shot down on a night mission. Now, our commanding officer had just taken over the squadron. You know, you're a commanding officer for a year and a half, no matter what your environment is, combat or non-combat. He had the change of command. He took over. He was the executive officer the whole time flying. I flew a bunch with him. This was his 3rd combat tour to Vietnam. He's a commander in 2005. And he liked to conserve gas. The rest of us were aware of gas, but we wouldn't conserve it. Now, the way you conserve gas is you go slow. He liked to go slow over hostile territory. Well, what we found out, what limited intelligence we have, is that he was hit with a surface-to-air missile that night near Haiphong, probably going slow. We didn't get his remains back till the 90s. Now, between the front seat and the back seat of that aircraft, they had 7 children. The skipper had 5, and the backseater, OJ, had 2. So that's another eye opener. So now we've lost 20% of our squadron right there in those 2 shoot downs. You get replacements pretty quick, but there's a cycle of getting them acclimated, getting them combat ready, because you just don't throw these new guys into combat right away. So we had an acting commanding officer, and ironically, our squadron, when they finally now had to reprogram someone to come out as a squadron commander, what they did is they gave us the outgoing skipper of Top Gun, and so he came to the squadron, and he became the CO. And I flew with him on his very first combat hop. Okay, and at that point, I had probably 100 combat missions, maybe 110. His name is Roger Box. A great guy, but sadly not a very good pilot, believe it or not. I mean, he was a good air combat maneuvering pilot. But see, what happened is that, the operations officer gets me in his stateroom. He says, okay, we got to get the skipper some combat. We're not going to send him to Hanoi or Haiphong, but the Rio's going to fly with him a few times, tell him what's going on, the coding and all this other stuff. And we're going to put some bombs on your airplane. Well, it'll be not a high defended target, so don't worry about it. We got to get his feet wet. He hadn't flown in combat in 2 or 3 years. And what he's been doing in Top Gun is all pulling 9Gs all over the place. And so I'm trying to cover everything I possibly can. And at this point, I'm a salty guy. I'm a lieutenant junior grade, but I'm salty, And so all of a sudden, I know what the procedures are for bombing. You're doing a certain speed. You're doing like 400 knots. You pull your nose up. You roll on your back. You pull your nose down. You get your 40-degree angle. And then we communicate with each other about altitudes and speeds, and then you drop the bombs and go. So he pulls the nose up, rolls halfway on his back, and then does this, wags his wings. Skipper, what are you doing? He goes, well, I didn't want the AAA gunner to get a tracking on me. Well, guess where the bombs went?
Off to one of the
They were
sides.
they were 2 countries away.
Yeah.
They didn't hit the right zip code, and so you have to sit down with your skipper once we're in the bomb and run. You want to get your pipper on the target, and he understood that. He was just a little gun shy, but unexperienced, but a good guy. But he sent me to Top Gun as the next Top Gun quarter, so I was happy.
Well, that's a good thing.
He was a good guy.
So, as you're losing crews throughout this 8-month period, and you're hearing what's going on politically, and you see the restrictions on the targets and how you can approach them and things like that, what in the moment when you were there in the squadron flying those combat missions day in and day out, what were your thoughts about the war? Was it worth it? How it was being fought? The cost of your buddies, your squadron mates, and those kinds of things. What were your thoughts then? And then I'll ask you, 50 years later, whatever you've learned, whatever you think about, how is that different?
Well, you had 2 levels of fighting the war. You had the hierarchy, the commanders, the captains and commanders that were doing the job and flying missions with you, but they they knew that the career was the most important thing. Their careers were the most important thing. We at the lieutenant junior grade level weren't still sure we were going to be in the Navy 5 years from now. I wasn't a career officer when I was 25 years old. And so, we tended to have our thoughts be known to the hierarchy that, I'm not going to take any crazy ass risks for this war, because it's not a war. I mean, it's a political nightmare. It's a disaster. You've got an incompetent country. We knew that in the guise of South Vietnam, corrupt, and we had a dedicated enemy in North Vietnam. So we weren't going to take a lot of extra chances, with certain exceptions. If we knew there was a gaggle of MiGs up there that we could shoot down, we would do that at all risk, period. However, if you're on a bombing mission for something stupid and you're going to put yourself at real big risk, you, more often than not, would be very cautious. Now, I mentioned earlier in our discussion that weather was a big issue. I can't tell you how many times myself and my squadron mates were forced to jettison all their bombs just in the Gulf of Tonkin, because we couldn't see the target, couldn't get to the target. And so in that era, in that summer of 72, we were not going to take a lot of risks unless it had a potential reward of being effective. We knew almost anything we did until the number one thing that convinced the enemy that they had to get to the table. Well, there were 2 things to get to the table, and we knew it, were the B-52 strikes, which I'll talk about in a minute, and the mining of Haiphong Harbor. We knew our government was not serious until they mined Haiphong Harbor. And they did that in August, big time. And I was on one of the first missions to escort the A6s, because they had to drop these monster mines. I mean, these things are like 1,000 pounds in the center of the harbor, and they had to drop it from the airplane like at 300 knots. Well, fighters can go a lot faster, and 300 knots is very dangerous in Haiphong Harbor. And so that mission, those kinds of missions you would do, you'd hang it out if you had to. But you did have to, because that was going to be a success, and that could be a game changer and save lives. But the lives we were losing and the equipment we were losing at the time were absolutely not worth it. Now, we're also hearing through our ears, radios and things, about what's going on in the United States. My friends, my counterparts, they're protesting. They're pissed off at the government. There's all this dissent going on. And the civil rights uh, situation in the United States in that summer of '72, it boiled over into the fleet. We had a race riot on the USS Kitty Hawk, and it was a very, very big deal. Uh, and I can talk about that later if you remind me and ask me about it, because it is a bit complicated. But it showed, it was initially suspected that it was African Americans trying to take over the ship, an attack aircraft carrier. And so that was proved ultimately not to be true, but that's how it influenced us also about what was going back on in the United States. And because we would also see our older contemporaries, our lieutenant commanders, just getting out of the Navy. Well, I respect you as a pilot. Why are you getting out of the Navy? And a lot of it boiled down to is the leadership, as I mentioned, were really only concerned with their own promotability and not necessarily with the mission. We were all very idealistic people going in on the front end of the Vietnam War because it was exciting. We'd never done anything like this. Your fathers and grandfathers did something like this. They glorified war to a certain extent, which I certainly have never done since going to war. And so you wanted to give it a try, and you wanted to make a difference for at least your squadron. And then it didn't take long to figure out you can't do that with the government doing what they're doing, with the restrictions, the rules. They didn't want to win, and they made it perfectly clear. And we were the cannon fodder.
Well, and this conversation is more than 50 years after that.
Right.
Have your perspectives changed about any of that? And if so, how?
Well, the change is based on education, maturing in life, becoming a senior officer, and reading extensively the aftermath of the Vietnam War and things they found out were going on that we weren't not aware of at our levels. There was so much government misrepresentation and lying that it changed my mind as to the trust level you put in government, especially back then. I mean, I never questioned anything about the government in my junior years in the Navy until probably 10 years after combat, when you start finding out things, as in the book Dereliction of Duty. The amount of money that we spent. Rolling Thunder was the earlier major bombing campaign in 1965 and 66, I think it was. And the CIA, after the war, did a study that compared what it cost the United States to do $1 of damage to the enemy with Rolling Thunder. What did it take? In 1966, it took $9.60 of the United States money to do $1 of damage. We were fighting a third world country. Vietnam, North Vietnam, was a third world country. South Vietnam was a second tier country, a little more developed, but not North Vietnam. And we wasted our time with that. But in reality, we were fighting Russia and Red China. And that's the way the Cold War was. And even though, I was in the heart of the Cold War and as an active duty person, the value of the way we did these client wars, we were fighting
Proxy
Russia.
wars.
Yes, exactly. We knew that our lives really meant very little to the government. And at that point, you have to say, well, uh, I can't I can't risk my squadron mate's life. What I'll do is fly as safe as I can and protect my squadron mates as best I can. But I know we can't win the war. And I knew that in that cruise. We could not win the war. At any given time, I think we had 21, was it 21 different aircraft carriers fight in Vietnam at some time or another. And we had some air wings in 1963 and 64 and 65 come back with half of their airplanes shot down. Half of the air wing.
Gone.
That's like 40 plus aircraft. John McCain was on the Bonhomme Richard when he got shot down in his A4. Half the air wing was shot down. They lost 40% of their pilots were killed in action. And at that point, those numbers, you become so disillusioned with it. I mean, we all came home from Vietnam just being extremely critical of the government first and the Navy second.
Well, I guess I'm a bit surprised then that you became a career officer. I mean, I too experienced that idealism early in my career and became a little more cynical and questioning of these decisions on high that had a lot of unintended consequences when they got to the bottom of the barrel. But you know, having lost squadron mates, good friends, and colleagues, and seeing these decisions out of the government and out of the Navy, you then went on to serve 3 decades. So, why?
Well, adrenaline. The peacetime flying was in Southern California was very exciting. And then I did another cruise after this combat cruise, peacetime cruise in the Western Pacific, which was great. I was still in the same squadron, 114 aardvarks. So that was, now you're exposed to peacetime flying, casual. However, you know, they're cutting money and all this other stuff, so you're not flying as much, but it's still pretty much fun. And then they hang the carrot about, you want to fly the F-14 Tomcat? Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So they offered me to be a flight instructor. So I stayed on. I had to apply to be a regular officer because people like me who went to AOCS, their commission was a reserve officer, and you had to do what they call augmentation. You, as an academy graduate, and it's the same with our academies, you are graduated to an officer's commission in a regular Navy or Air Force. We were not. So we had to apply. We had to show the powers to be that we were worth keeping. So, and I went through the process and did it, and I was accepted. But then I flew the F-14 as an instructor for 3 years. That was a kick. And I delivered an airplane to Iran, the only country to ever buy the F-14 Tomcat. I flew with an Iranian pilot for like 6 months, training him in American ways of tactics. That was great fun. But it was the fun factor and the adrenaline of flying those airplanes. But I didn't make a decision to stay in the Navy at that point. Matter of fact, I came back to the fleet and I went to a squadron called VF-213 Black Lions. And by coming back to the fleet, that means I signed on for another 3 years, which took me to 10 years. And so this would have been 1979. Then I had a really terrible commanding officer, an absolute egomaniac that would have killed people and just unbelievably incompetent. And I said, okay. And I saw all my friends, people I respected, people like Pete Pettigrew, we talked about, Viper, who was in the movie and all of those things. Saw him getting out of the Navy. and going in the reserves. And the reserves, the fighter squadron reserves at Miramar, it was the vacation club flying. It was just a lot of, so I did that. I came off active duty, went in the reserves, worked in the real estate market in San Diego, which was, commercial real estate, which was pretty hot. And then, I was one of these guys that never tracked promotion lists or any of that stuff. I did what I did, and the normal promotions came along, except for '05 and '06. I wasn't even paying attention. I get a phone call. I was a lieutenant commander. I get a phone call, and they say, "Hey, Denny, you gotta go get a new uniform. You got promoted to commander, '05." I didn't know I was eligible. And then, 4 years later, in 1991, I get the same phone call from the same person, by the way, and it says, "You got to go buy a captain's uniform." And I was absolutely shocked because I had a few dings in my record, which is normal. A couple of times in hack. Hack is when you're restricted to the ship for whatever reason.
No, not you.
Yeah, and we could get into that at some other time. But so at that point, I was still in the reserves when I got promoted to captain, and I said, this could be fun. I might be able to turn this into some exciting duty. And so I joined they closed Miramar. I got involved in a reserve unit at North Island Naval Air Station, San Diego, Coronado, and became the commanding officer of the unit, which was, like, commanding officer was a lot of fun. It wasn't a flying unit. It was a staff administrative unit, but it had men and women and young and older, and so I really enjoyed it. And then the admiral knocks on my door, Vice Admiral Brent Bennett. He says, "Hey, Denis, our safety officer here at AirPac has got to go to the Navy War College. Can you come on active duty full-time for 3 months and be the safety officer?" Now, this is a safety officer for almost 200,000 people, 11 nuclear aircraft carriers, and 2,000 aircraft. The safety officer, that's the Pacific Fleet. I said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Only 3 months, Denis." Well, I was on active duty for 13 years. But what happened is they started bribing me. I'll be honest with you. 9/11 put me in the luckiest environment you could possibly imagine. Before 9/11, I'm working at AirPac in San Diego. I get a call from a close friend at the Pentagon and says, "Hey, listen, one of the things you've been doing is something called operational risk management, and we'd like to do that Navy-wide. So we want to give you a 3-year set of orders and an office in the Pentagon, and you'll travel all over the world, talking to Navy units about operational risk management, because we were losing a lot of aircraft. We had a lot of accidents with kids in cars getting killed, a lot of suicide, just losing a lot of people. So they wanted to kind of give it a little bit more attention." So I said, "I'll do that." And I did that. Then 9/11 happens, and that changed life. I had an office in the Pentagon. Unfortunately, my office was hit partially, but I was in Japan at the time giving lectures to the USS Kitty Hawk, who was forward deployed carrier to Japan. And then those set of orders expired. They were a lot of fun. Then I get the call from the Bureau of Naval Personnel, and they said, "Hey, Denis, would you like to still stay in the Navy a while?" Now, we had already invaded Iraq. So this would have been 2003. And I knew they were trying to recruit, no matter what your background was, senior officers to do the Iraqi provincial, whatever it was called. And the way our Bureau of Naval Personnel worked, it was if the Bureau starts talking to you about a set of orders that they have to fill, you got to take them. No questions asked. They say, "So do you want to stay in?" And if you say yes, you're in that boat. So I said, "Okay, I'll roll the dice. I'll take a chance." And they said, "Okay, here's the deal. You got to leave in 3 weeks, but you got to go to the Navy War College in Newport, Rhode Island and get a master's degree. Take a year." because they couldn't find somebody with a fighter background. In the war colleges, they try to balance the classes, civilians, military, Army, Navy, joint, all kinds of stuff. So you get that academic flavor from different perspectives. And they said, oh, and then, oh, by the way, then you'll owe us 2 years after that. But we'll give you a good job. We'll get a good job for you probably at National Defense University. And they did. So they kept giving me these just wonderful things.
Really, offers you can't refuse.
You can't. And so I enjoyed the parking spots in front of the Oak Club for captains. so then finally I get the call in 2008. 2008, I get the phone call from the little old lady with sneakers in the basement of the Pentagon. And she says, Captain, where do you want us to send your retirement orders? I go, you just gave me a set of 3-year orders 6 months ago. They said, well, we've been able to waive all those requirements for you because we wanted you to stay in. But there's only one requirement we can't waive. You're eligible for Social Security. So you have to get out. I said, okay.
So your career spanned 1969
to 2008.
to 2008.
Well, 2008, when I retired in 2008, I was the last Navy combat veteran to retire from active duty.
Vietnam combat veteran.
Vietnam combat veteran. Nobody else. There was still a doctor or law. There was a doctor and a lawyer still on active duty, but they weren't combat guys.
Now, let me get that clear again. You were the last
Navy
combat
veteran.
Vietnam combat veteran or combat aviator?
Veteran of the Vietnam War. Yeah, combat.
Right. So
there were a whole bunch of new combat veterans because of Iraq.
Right, but no, you were the last
Vietnam
combat veteran who was serving on active duty.
Correct. So I retired
after, do the math,
39 years.
39 years. That's quite a run.
It was very exciting. The worst part were the losses. I've got 9 friends on the wall.
Yeah. Well, what's it like when you go to the wall now? Do you visit your buddies that you know when you go to the wall?
Yeah.
When did you go to the wall the first time?
I think it was, I wrote in that little story I wrote, I think it was 87, because I was stationed in California that whole time, and I had not come back to Washington. So I came back to Washington. I want to say it was 87. And I think I mentioned it to you. I wanted to do it at night because I couldn't. The stories I've heard, from other friends that had been to the wall were overwhelming. And it just brings back such memories. But I was shocked and delighted, I guess, to see those names. And there were a lot of people there that night. It was like 1 o'clock in the morning. And but for the same reason.
So you were delighted to see that they were remembered.
Yes. And as you walk up to the wall for the first time, the letters, they start getting bigger and bigger because, when you're back on coming towards it, you can't see the names. And then you go, holy Christmas, that's magnificent. That was a big eye opener to see that.
So you looked up the 9 names.
Yeah.
Did you leave anything for them?
Yes. What did I leave? I left an air medal. In Vietnam, I was awarded 9, and so I left 1.
And you've gone back many times since then.
Yeah. Well, with you.
Well, do you stop and see your guys?
I do occasionally. Some of them are buried in Arlington National Cemetery. which is good. But some of those 9, they were not all in my squadron, but they were all in other squadrons and friends. Some of the remains have still not been returned. Whether they were shot down over North Vietnam or had not been found. You just don't know what the status of that is. But it's eye-opening, especially with just the numbers. I mean, 58,281. You know, that's a big chunk of your generation, and the vast majority of that are people under 30, way under 30. And so it's just a sad state, especially for the young enlisted men and women, men primarily, you know, that just had their lives terminated. And in hindsight, you know, I'm 76 years old, and in hindsight, just to think how much I enjoyed life in that time frame if my life was cut short as theirs was. So you get philosophical as you get older.
Well, last question I'll ask is, going forward, what do you hope that visitors to the wall will take from it?
I'm a firm believer in the Colin Powell rules of war. Don't go to war unless you've got the full support of the government and the people. That's got to be number one. Don't go to war unless it's valuable and it's ultimately going to make the world better. Keep your population educated as to what it's all about, why you're doing it, and don't make it obvious that it's purely political, because it can't be. The cliche about, you know, old men make wars and young men fight wars is very true. And that's mainly because you'd never get an older guy to fight a war because he's too smart. He understands what's at stake, and it's significant. It's significant.